I didn't raise my voice when I shut down the only bridge into their neighborhood. I just turned a key, and 312 homes learned what dependency really feels like. The metal latch clicked with a clean, hollow sound that echoed across the river like a warning nobody had taken seriously until that exact moment, and the hum of engines idling on both sides of the span built into a low, restless vibration under my boots. Morning fog still clung to the water, thin and cold, carrying the faint smell of wet steel and river mud, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and reminds you that some structures outlast the people who think they own them. I stood there, one hand resting on the control box bolted into the original concrete footing, watching headlights stack up in a slow, confused line as commuters realized something wasn't right. This bridge wasn't new. It wasn't part of their master plan community with matching mailboxes and HOA-approved paint colors. It had been here for decades, long before the first cul-de-sac was carved into the hillside, long before anyone named Victoria Hale decided she could redraw boundaries with a clipboard and a smile. What they saw as an entrance, I saw as a system, a single narrow point where everything they built funneled through steel, timber, and a set of property rights nobody had bothered to read. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer by trade, and I bought 1,500 acres of land outside their HOA because I wanted distance from noise, from rules written by people who never built anything with their hands, from the kind of control that comes wrapped in polite language and certified letters. The land came with rolling hills, a shallow river that cut across the eastern edge, and one overlooked detail that didn't show up in the listing photos, but changed everything. This bridge. It was old, sure, weathered guardrails, bolts stained dark from years of rain, but structurally sound, built back when engineers overdesigned everything because failure wasn't an option. The county maps labeled it as private infrastructure. The deed made it clearer. Sole ownership. No shared easement. No public access requirement. Just a line of legal text that most people would skim right past without understanding what it meant. I didn't skim. I never do. The first time I drove across it, the boards creaked under my tires in that steady, predictable rhythm that told me everything I needed to know. Solid. Reliable. Mine. At the time, it just felt like part of the property, another feature to maintain, another line item in a long list of responsibilities. I didn't realize it was the backbone of an entire community that hadn't even finished building yet. Because a few miles downriver, beyond a stretch of land I didn't think twice about, survey stakes started appearing like quiet warnings. Then came the grading crews, the scent of fresh asphalt drifting through the trees, the distant rumble of heavy equipment turning open land into something organized, something controlled. Willow Creek Estates, they called it. A perfect neighborhood, designed down to the inch, marketed with drone shots and promises of exclusivity. What they didn't mention, what nobody mentioned, was how every road they built, every driveway they poured, every family that moved in would eventually rely on a single crossing point to get in and out. My bridge. And the morning I locked it down, watching their perfect system stall in real time, I realized something simple and absolute. They thought I lived outside their HOA. They were wrong. They had built their entire world inside my infrastructure. The first time I stood on that bridge as the owner, there were no lines of cars, no honking, no flashing hazard lights reflecting off the guardrails, just the quiet rhythm of water sliding under steel and the soft crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked the full span end to end like I always do with any structure I am responsible for, checking the joints, listening to the subtle creaks that tell you more than any report ever could, feeling the temperature difference between sun-warmed metal and the cooler shadowed beams underneath, because that is how I was trained, and that is how my father taught me before I ever stepped into a classroom, that you do not trust paperwork until you trust what your hands and your ears confirm. I grew up around infrastructure, not in some abstract way, but in the kind of way where dinner conversations revolved around load limits and soil stability, where weekends meant riding along in a pickup truck that smelled like coffee and engine oil, while my father inspected rural bridges nobody else thought twice about, the kind of bridges that quietly carried entire communities without ever being noticed until something went wrong. He used to say that the strongest structures are the ones people forget are there, because that means they are doing their job perfectly. When I bought this land, I was not looking for control over anyone else. I was looking for that same kind of quiet, the kind you only get when your nearest neighbor is measured in acres instead of feet, and the only sounds at night are wind moving through grass and the distant hum of insects instead of traffic and lawn equipment. 1,500 acres gave me that space, rolling terrain that shifted from open fields to clusters of oak and cedar, a narrow river cutting through the eastern boundary like a natural line you do not cross without thinking about it, and a single access point that most buyers would have seen as a limitation, but I saw as a responsibility. The bridge had been built in the late 1970s, back when materials were heavier, tolerances were stricter, and engineers still assumed that if you built something it might need to last 50 years or more without shortcuts. And when I went through the records, I found the original construction permits, the inspection logs, even handwritten notes from the engineer who signed off on the load rating. Details most people would never read, but to me felt like a conversation across time. I ran my own assessments, checked the abutments, verified the drainage, confirmed that the structure could handle far more than the occasional pickup truck or delivery van. And then I did something most people would not have bothered with. I filed updated documentation with the county reaffirming its status as private infrastructure. Not because I expected it to matter, but because that is what you do when you understand how systems fail. They do not fail all at once. They fail because small details get ignored until they become leverage for someone else. At the time, there was no one else, just open land beyond my property line and a long stretch of undeveloped terrain that made the bridge feel like a relic from a different era, a piece of engineering waiting for a purpose it might never need to fulfill. I remember standing there one evening as the sun dropped low enough to turn the river into a sheet of copper, the air cooling just enough to carry the scent of damp earth and cut grass, thinking that if I maintained this place properly, it would outlast me the same way it had outlasted the last owner, a quiet asset in a quiet life. What I did not realize then was that somewhere beyond those trees, plans were already being drawn, permits were already being filed, and an entire neighborhood was about to rise on the assumption that access is something you can always take for granted, that roads will always be open, that infrastructure simply exists to serve whoever shows up. That assumption is what built everything you saw backing up behind me that morning, and it is also what made every single one of those cars stop the moment I decided otherwise. I first saw her before I ever heard her name, standing on a temporary overlook that had not existed the week before, heels planted in fresh gravel like she owned the horizon, one hand resting on a clipboard, the other holding a phone she barely glanced at because she did not need to. The kind of person who carries control in her posture instead of her words. The air that morning smelled different, not like river water and soil, but like hot asphalt and new concrete curing under the sun. That sharp, synthetic scent that tells you something permanent is being forced into place whether the land agrees with it or not. Survey flags had multiplied overnight, thin strips of bright plastic snapping in the wind like warning signals, and beyond them, machines moved in steady lines, carving roads that curved with deliberate precision toward my boundary without ever crossing it. Not yet. I watched for a while before walking over, boots sinking slightly into ground that had been packed down by heavy tires, feeling the vibration of distant engines through the soles like a low, constant pulse. That is when she turned, already smiling, already prepared, as if she had been expecting me to show up exactly at that moment. Victoria Hale did not introduce herself like a neighbor. She introduced herself like a system. Her voice was smooth, measured, the kind of tone that sounds polite until you realize it leaves no room for disagreement, and her eyes moved quickly, taking in details, measuring, categorizing, deciding. She wore white, not bright, but controlled. Like everything else about her, and behind her stretched the early bones of a neighborhood that would soon look finished enough to convince people it had always been there. Willow Creek Estates, she said, as if the name itself carried authority, as if saying it out loud made it real in a way that overrode everything that came before. She spoke about community standards, about property values, about how development brings opportunity, each sentence landing clean and rehearsed, each phrase designed to sound reasonable until you noticed what was missing, any acknowledgement that the land she was shaping did not exist in isolation. When she gestured toward the road being cut through the trees, her hand passed over the direction of the bridge without stopping, like it was already included in her plans, like it had always been part of her map. I asked a simple question, the kind that does not need interpretation, about access, about how vehicles would enter and exit once construction finished, and for a fraction of a second her smile tightened, just enough to register if you were looking for it. Then it returned, smoother than before, and she explained that everything had been accounted for, that her team had secured all necessary permissions, that there would be a seamless connection to the existing route across the river. Existing route. That was the phrase she chose, not private bridge, not individually owned structure, just a neutral term that erased ownership without ever saying it out loud. I let her finish, let the wind carry the faint hum of machinery between us, let the sound of gravel shifting under passing trucks fill the silence before I answered. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is not correct someone too early. She assumed I was just another landowner on the edge of her project, someone who would eventually adapt or comply, someone who would accept the slow expansion of her influence as an inevitable part of growth. And to be fair, most people would have. Most people do not read every line of a deed. Most people do not trace infrastructure back to its origin point. Most people see a road being built and assume it belongs to whoever built it. Victoria Hale built her confidence on that assumption, on the idea that control flows from appearance, from momentum, from the illusion that everything has already been decided. What she did not understand, standing there with the sun reflecting off her clipboard and the smell of fresh pavement rising around us, was that her entire plan depended on a structure she had not even asked about, a structure she had already started to treat like it was hers simply because it connected her world to the rest of it. And in that moment, watching her outline a future that quietly ran through something she did not own, I realized this was not going to be a simple boundary discussion. It was going to be a lesson in what happens when someone builds a system on top of a foundation they never bothered to verify. The first sign that something had shifted was not a letter or a phone call. It was the sound of tires crossing my bridge before sunrise, heavier than usual, more frequent, the steady rhythm of construction vehicles moving with purpose instead of passing through by chance. And when I stepped outside that morning, the air carried that same sharp mix of diesel exhaust and fresh asphalt that had been creeping closer day by day. Only now it was sitting right on top of the river like it belonged. There. I drove down to the bridge expecting to see a crew staging nearby, maybe a temporary access plan that still respected the boundary, but what I found instead was a line of orange cones placed along the edge of my property and a freshly installed sign mounted directly into the gravel shoulder that read, Willow Creek Estates main entrance, in clean, polished lettering that had not been there the night before. The metal post was anchored into ground I knew better than my own driveway, driven straight through a survey marker I had set myself weeks earlier, and the weight of that realization settled in quietly, not as anger, not yet, but as something colder, something more precise. I parked, stepped out, and the crunch of gravel under my boots sounded sharper than usual, like every step was registering the change in ownership that had not actually happened, but was already being treated as fact. A foreman stood near the far end, clipboard in hand, talking into a radio with the kind of distracted focus that comes from following orders rather than making decisions. And when I asked him who authorized the installation, he did not hesitate, did not even look uncertain. He simply said the name like it answered everything. Victoria Hale, as if that was all the explanation required. I let the silence hang for a moment, listening to the hum of engines idling on the other side, watching a concrete truck ease its way across the span, its weight pressing down on a structure that had been designed for exactly that kind of load, but not for that kind of assumption, not for being treated as part of a system it was never meant to serve without permission. I pointed to the sign, asked him if he had any documentation showing access rights, easements, anything that justified turning private infrastructure into a public entry point. And he gave me the same look you get from someone who has never been asked that question before, a brief pause followed by a shrug that said it was not his problem to solve. That was when I realized how far this had already gone, not in paperwork, but in perception, because once a crew starts acting like something belongs to them, the rest of the system tends to follow. Over the next few days, the traffic increased, not just construction vehicles, but delivery vans, inspectors, even prospective buyers driving through as if the route had always been open, their tires leaving faint tracks along the edges where grass had not yet been pushed back by repetition. I started noticing small changes layered on top of each other, temporary barriers repositioned to guide vehicles more efficiently, gravel spread in thin lines to widen the approach, reflective markers added along the rails like subtle branding that said this was now part of something organized, something controlled. Then came the letter, printed on thick paper with clean margins and language that tried to sound collaborative while quietly rewriting reality, informing me that the access point across the river had been integrated into the community's transportation plan, and that ongoing usage would be maintained to ensure continuity for residents and service providers, followed by a line about shared responsibility for upkeep that implied I would be expected to contribute to maintenance costs for a system I had never agreed to join. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see exactly how they framed it, how they turned assumption into expectation without ever acknowledging the step in between, and when I folded it back up the paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just ink. I drove back down to the bridge that evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the water, and stood there listening to the distant echo of traffic continuing even as the light faded, realizing that this was no longer a misunderstanding or a casual overstep. This was a full integration attempt built on the belief that if you move fast enough and confidently enough, ownership becomes a technicality instead of a barrier, and standing there with the smell of warm metal and river air mixing around me, I understood one thing clearly. This was no longer a small issue that could be corrected with a conversation. This was a system expanding without permission, and systems like that do not stop on their own. I handled it the way I handle any problem that looks like it might still be resolved with logic, calmly, directly, and with documentation in hand, because escalation is a tool you use carefully, not something you jump to when a situation can still be corrected at the source. The next morning I drove to the temporary office they had set up near the front of the development, a modular building that smelled faintly of new carpet and printer toner, the kind of place designed to look official even before anything around it is finished, and I walked in with a folder that contained every relevant document, from the original deed to the updated filings I had submitted myself. Victoria was already there, of course, seated behind a clean desk with architectural renderings spread out in neat stacks, sunlight coming through the front windows and reflecting off glossy paper that showed tree-lined streets and perfectly spaced homes, a version of reality that did not include the river or the bridge except as a thin line connecting everything together. She looked up as I entered, that same controlled smile settling into place like it had been waiting for me, and gestured toward a chair without asking why I was there, because she already knew. I set the folder down between us, the weight of it landing with a soft, deliberate thud, and opened it to the page that mattered most, the section that clearly defined ownership and access rights in language that left no room for interpretation. I explained it in simple terms, not because it was complicated, but because clarity matters when you are giving someone a chance to correct a mistake, that the bridge was private, that there was no easement, that any use beyond my permission was unauthorized, and that the signage, the traffic, the integration into her development all needed to stop immediately. For a brief moment, she did not respond, just looked at the document like it was something she had seen before but chosen not to acknowledge, and then she leaned back slightly, folding her hands in a way that signaled the conversation was about to shift from facts to positioning. She thanked me for bringing it to her attention, her tone still smooth, still measured, and then explained that their legal team had reviewed all access points and determined that the route across the river functioned as a necessary connection for the community. That continuity of access was essential for emergency services, deliveries, and residents, and that interrupting that flow would create complications that could not simply be reversed without broader impact. It was not a denial of ownership, not directly, but it was something more subtle, an attempt to reframe the situation so that my rights became an inconvenience instead of a boundary. I pointed out that necessity does not override property law, that infrastructure does not become public just because it is useful, and that the longer they continued to operate under that assumption, the more complicated it would become for everyone involved. She listened, nodding slightly, but there was a disconnect between acknowledgement and intention, like she was hearing me without actually considering change. Then she slid a document across the desk toward me, a proposed agreement that outlined shared maintenance responsibilities and a modest monthly compensation for continued access, presented as a solution, as if this had always been a negotiation rather than a correction. The paper was crisp, the terms carefully worded, and for a second I could almost admire the strategy, because it was efficient. Offer a path that makes the violation feel like a partnership, turn resistance into participation, make the other party feel like they are gaining something instead of giving up control. I closed the folder slowly, the sound of paper against paper sharp in the quiet room, and told her I was not interested in selling access to something she did not have the right to use in the first place. That this was not about compensation, it was about ownership. The smile held, but there was a faint tightening at the edges now, a subtle shift that most people would miss but I did not, and she responded with a reminder that development moves forward, that communities grow, that sometimes individual interests need to align with broader progress. A statement that sounded reasonable until you realized it was just another way of saying they intended to continue exactly as they had been. I left that office with the same documents I walked in with, the same clear understanding of the situation, but also with something new, the realization that logic alone was not going to stop this, because I had just offered them a chance to correct course, and they had chosen to keep building anyway. They did not slow down after that meeting, they accelerated, and that told me everything I needed to know about how they planned to handle this, not by resolving it, but by outpacing it, by building fast enough that reversing course would feel impossible, and within a week the bridge stopped feeling like a boundary and started feeling like a highway. The traffic pattern changed first, no longer scattered construction runs, but organized flows, morning and evening surges that lined up with work schedules, the low hum of engines stacking into a steady stream that never quite stopped. And with it came the subtle modifications that only someone paying attention would notice. Additional gravel laid along the shoulders to widen the approach, temporary signage replaced with permanent markers, reflective strips added along the rails as if branding the structure into their system. I stood there one afternoon as a line of vehicles moved across in both directions, sunlight flashing off windshields, the smell of heated rubber and dust rising into the air, and realized they were no longer treating this as borrowed access. They were treating it as established infrastructure. A few days later, another letter arrived, thicker than the first, more formal, the language sharpened just enough to remove any sense of collaboration, outlining a schedule of usage expectations, maintenance coordination, and something new, a fee structure that implied I would be billed for any actions that disrupted what they now referred to as community traffic flow. I read that line twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be sure they had actually written it that way, that they were confident enough to put that assumption in print. The paper smelled faintly of fresh ink, still new, like it had been drafted quickly, and when I set it down on the table the edges aligned perfectly with the first letter, a neat stack of decisions made without my consent. I tried one more time, not with her, but with the system behind her, reaching out to the county office, requesting confirmation of any filed easements, any approved changes to access designation, any documentation that might explain how a private bridge had been integrated into a residential development without direct authorization. The response came back clean, almost too clean, no recorded easements, no approved transfers, no public designation, just the same classification that had been there since the original filing, private infrastructure under single ownership. On paper, nothing had changed. In reality, everything had. The disconnect between those two states was where the real problem lived, not in legality, but in momentum, because the longer they operated as if it belonged to them, the more everyone else would start to believe it did. I noticed it in the behavior of the drivers, the way they no longer slowed when entering the bridge, no longer looked for signage or signals, just drove straight across with the confidence of routine, and I noticed it in the way service vehicles treated the route, navigation systems now directing them through my property, as if it were part of a public grid. Even the wear patterns began to shift, tire marks darkening in consistent lines, the sound of boards under load becoming more frequent, more predictable, like the structure itself was being retrained to serve a different purpose. That was the moment I stopped thinking about this as a dispute and started thinking about it as a system that had already crossed a threshold, because once usage becomes habit and habit becomes expectation, reversing it is no longer a conversation, it is a disruption. And standing there with the late afternoon heat radiating off the metal rails, listening to the steady flow of traffic that had no idea it was operating on borrowed ground, I understood something clearly. They were not just ignoring ownership anymore. They were building dependence on top of it, layer by layer, until the idea of stopping would feel like breaking something essential. And that is exactly the kind of setup that makes the final move matter. The shift did not happen all at once. It came in small details that most people would overlook, but once you see them, you cannot unsee them. And the first one hit me late one evening as I stood at the far end of the bridge watching a steady stream of headlights move across like a pattern that had already settled into routine, because something about the timing felt too consistent, too optimized for something that was supposed to be temporary. The air was cooler that night, carrying the faint smell of cut grass from the new lawns inside the development, mixed with the lingering heat from pavement that had not fully released the day. And as I listened to the rhythm of traffic, I started noticing gaps that lined up almost perfectly with internal intersections I had never even driven through, like the entire flow had already been engineered around this single crossing point. That is when it clicked, not just as a suspicion but as a clear structural realization. They were no longer treating the bridge as access. They were designing their entire internal circulation system around it. I drove back to the house and pulled up the county planning portal, the glow of the screen casting a cold light across the room as I dug through filings, zoning maps, transportation layouts, documents that most people never bother to read, but that tell you exactly how a system is supposed to function when you put them together in the right order. It took less than an hour to find what I needed: a submitted traffic impact study tied to their development permit, a document that outlined projected vehicle counts, peak usage hours, emergency access routes, and most importantly, a single highlighted connection labeled as primary ingress and egress across the river. They had not named the bridge directly, but the coordinates matched perfectly, down to the exact alignment of the roadway they had built leading up to it. I zoomed in, tracing the lines with my finger like I was following a blueprint of something that had already been constructed in their minds long before the first piece of gravel was laid. And there it was in plain language: all internal roads converging toward that crossing point. No secondary exit, no alternate route, just one path in and one path out, and it ran straight through my property. I leaned back in the chair, the faint hum of the air conditioning filling the silence, and let that settle in, not as frustration but as clarity, because this was no longer about misunderstanding or overreach. This was design. They had planned an entire community around infrastructure they did not own, and they had done it with enough confidence that they never even considered what would happen if that assumption was wrong. The more I read, the clearer it became. Emergency services routing depended on it. Delivery logistics depended on it. Even their projected property values factored in seamless access across that exact point, which meant every home they sold, every contract they signed, every promise they made was built on a foundation they did not control. I closed the laptop slowly, the click of the lid final in a way that felt heavier than it should have, and stepped back outside. The night air cooler now, the sounds of distant traffic still moving across the bridge with the same quiet certainty as before. Standing there in the dark, listening to a system operate exactly as it had been designed, I realized something that changed the entire equation. They were not just using my bridge, they had made it the center of their entire network. And that meant every single piece of their world depended on something they had never secured. And once you understand where a system depends, you understand exactly where it can be stopped. Once you see the dependency, the next step is not emotion, it is verification, because assumptions are what got them into this position in the first place, and I was not about to repeat that mistake on my side. The next morning started earlier than usual, the air still cool and carrying that damp river scent that fades once the sun climbs high enough. And I was already at the desk before the first vehicle crossed the bridge, pulling together every piece of documentation that defined what that structure actually was in legal terms. Not what it looked like, not how it was being used, but what it was recognized as. On record, I requested certified copies of the original deed, the full chain of title, and every amendment filed since the bridge was first constructed, the kind of paperwork that most people only think about when something goes wrong, but that quietly defines ownership long before conflict ever shows up. When the documents came in, printed on thick county paper with raised seals and signatures that carried more weight than any verbal agreement, I laid them out across the table and went through them line by line, not because I expected surprises, but because confirmation matters when you are about to act on something that affects more than just you. There it was again, exactly as I remembered: private infrastructure, sole ownership, no recorded easement, no shared access agreement, no conditional use clause that could be interpreted as community entitlement, just a clear boundary written in language that had held up for decades without being challenged. I did not stop there. I pulled the survey maps, both the original and the updated ones I had commissioned after purchasing the land, overlays that showed precise coordinates, boundary lines, and the exact placement of the bridge relative to the property edge, and I compared them to the development plans Willow Creek had filed, aligning points, tracing routes, confirming that every single vehicle entering or exiting their community was crossing a structure that legally belonged to me and me alone. The more I cross-referenced, the more complete the picture became, not just ownership but responsibility, because with private infrastructure comes control, and with control comes the authority to determine access, usage, and limitations, all of it clearly outlined in state property law that does not bend just because a situation becomes inconvenient for someone else. I reached out to a colleague I trust, someone who specializes in land use and infrastructure law, and walked him through the situation step by step, sending over the documents, the maps, the traffic study I had uncovered, and we spent the better part of an hour going through scenarios, not hypotheticals but real applications of the law as it stands. His conclusion was as direct as it was unsurprising. They had no legal right to use the bridge, no claim to access, and no standing to enforce any terms related to its operation, and if anything, their continued use without permission strengthened my position rather than weakened it. I asked him one more question, not about whether I could act, but about what would happen if I did, and his answer came with the kind of pause that tells you the implications are larger than the question. He said that based on the dependency they had built, any interruption would have immediate and widespread impact, not just inconvenience, but a full system disruption, because everything they had designed pointed to that one crossing. I leaned back, the chair creaking softly under the shift in weight, and looked out toward the bridge where traffic had already started to build for the morning, headlights moving in that same steady pattern that now felt less like routine and more like exposure. And in that moment the situation settled into something simple and unavoidable. They had built a system on top of an assumption, and I now had every piece of evidence needed to prove that assumption was wrong. The only question left was not whether I could act, but when and how precisely I wanted that moment to land. Once I had the documents laid out and the legal position confirmed, the next step was not confrontation, it was alignment, because systems like this do not collapse from a single point of pressure unless everything around that point is ready to hold when the weight shifts. I started with the people who actually understood how things work beneath the surface, not the ones making decisions in offices, but the ones who build, maintain, and inspect what keeps a place running day to day. The county surveyor was first, an older man who had been mapping land in this area longer than most of the development had even existed, and when I showed him the updated overlays and pointed to the traffic routing, he did not look surprised, just leaned in closer, tracing the boundary line with a finger that had probably followed thousands of similar lines over the years. He confirmed what I already knew, that no easement had ever been recorded, that any use beyond permission was technically unauthorized, and more importantly, that if this ever went to formal review, the lack of documentation on their side would not be something they could explain away easily. From there I reached out to a structural engineer I had worked with before, someone who specialized in load ratings and liability, and we walked through the current usage patterns, the increased traffic, the weight distribution, not because the bridge could not handle it, but because liability shifts when usage changes without consent, and he made it clear that continued operation under these conditions without formal agreement did not just affect ownership, it exposed risk, the kind that insurance companies and regulatory bodies pay very close attention to. That piece mattered, because it added another layer to the situation, one that extended beyond property lines into accountability. The final conversation was with a legal team that had handled infrastructure disputes before, not general practice attorneys, but people who understood how access, dependency, and control intersect when private systems are treated like public ones. We sat down with every document, every map, every timeline of how this had unfolded, and they built a clear picture of not just what had happened, but how it would be interpreted if challenged. Their assessment was consistent across the board. The longer the usage continued without correction, the more exposure the development created for itself, not just in terms of access rights, but in terms of misrepresentation to buyers, to service providers, to anyone who had been told that entry and exit were guaranteed. That was the part that shifted the entire situation from a simple boundary issue to something much larger, because now it was not just about me and them. It was about every promise they had made that depended on something they did not control. I stood on the bridge later that evening, the air cooling as the sun dropped behind the tree line, watching the steady flow of vehicles continue without hesitation, and for the first time I was not looking at it as a problem to solve, but as a system fully committed to a path that had no built-in alternative. The sound of tires on wood, the faint vibration underfoot, the consistent pattern of movement, all of it reinforced the same conclusion. They had built everything around this single point and never once secured it. And as the last light faded and the headlights became the only markers of motion, I realized that what I had now was not just proof. It was leverage supported by people who understood exactly how far that leverage could extend. And once that kind of alignment is in place, the outcome is no longer uncertain. It is just a matter of timing. Once everything was confirmed, every document aligned, every expert on the same page, the situation stopped feeling reactive and started feeling precise, like a system waiting for the right moment to shift. And that is when I stopped thinking about stopping them immediately and started thinking about when it would matter most. Because timing changes everything, especially when the other side believes they are secure. I did not block access right away. I did not send another letter. I did not escalate through the same channels they had already chosen to ignore. Instead, I watched. I let the system grow exactly the way they designed it. Let the traffic increase. Let the routines settle. Let every resident, every delivery driver, every service provider build their expectations around that single crossing point without interruption. The morning flows became predictable, peak hours forming clean patterns, 7 to 9 for outbound traffic, 4 to 6 for return, weekends shifting slightly, but still centered around the same dependency. And each day that pattern reinforced itself deeper into the structure of their community. I kept records, not just documents but observations, timestamps, traffic counts, the kind of data that turns a situation from anecdotal into undeniable, because when you act, you want the outcome to stand on more than just principle. I installed a discrete monitoring system at the bridge, nothing intrusive, just enough to log usage and verify the scale of dependency that had already taken hold. And within days the numbers confirmed what I already knew, hundreds of crossings per day, every single one passing through a structure that legally belonged to me. Meanwhile, the development pushed forward at full speed, more homes completed, more families moving in, more systems tying into the same access point, utilities, services, everything routing through that single line across the river. And then they made the mistake that shifted everything from advantage to inevitability. They filed a formal complaint. Not about ownership, not about access rights, but about disruption risk. A document submitted to the county claiming that any interference with the current access route would negatively impact residents, emergency response times, and overall community functionality, essentially putting in writing that their entire system depended on uninterrupted use of that bridge. I read that filing carefully, the words structured to sound protective, responsible, even necessary, but what it actually did was confirm every assumption I had been verifying on my side, not just privately, but in an official record that could not be taken back. They had documented their own dependency. They had declared it as fact. I printed that document and added it to the stack on my desk, aligning it with everything else, ownership records, survey maps, traffic data, all pointing to the same conclusion from different angles. Then I prepared the final step, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate. I had a licensed contractor install a reinforced gate system at the bridge entrance, integrated cleanly into the existing structure, designed to meet all safety standards while still giving me full control over access. And I had proper signage fabricated, clear, professional, and legally precise, stating private infrastructure, access by authorization only. Everything was done by the book, permits filed where required, documentation updated, nothing left open to interpretation. I scheduled the activation for a Monday morning, just before peak traffic, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the moment when the system would feel the shift most clearly, when the dependency they had built would become visible to everyone at once. And standing there the night before, Looking out over the quiet bridge under a sky that gave no indication of what was about to change, I realized that this was no longer about stopping them. It was about showing them exactly what they had built their entire world on, and what happens when that foundation is no longer taken for granted. At exactly 6:12 a.m., I turned the key. The sound was small, almost insignificant, a clean mechanical click that disappeared into the cool morning air, but what followed carried much further than noise ever could, because the flow stopped. Not abruptly, not violently, just stopped. The first car slowed, then the next, then the line behind it compressed into stillness, engines idling, headlights cutting through the low layer of fog that hovered just above the river like it had been waiting to witness the moment. I stood a few feet back from the gate, hands relaxed, watching the pattern break in real time. The same pattern I had studied for weeks now unraveling exactly where I knew it would. The metal barrier sat flush against the reinforced posts, the signage clear and impossible to misinterpret, private structure, authorized access only, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the quiet hum of engines and the faint ripple of water moving beneath the bridge, like the system itself had not yet processed what had changed. Then came the reactions, not loud, not chaotic, just confusion spreading from car to car as drivers leaned forward, looking past windshields, checking for workers, for detours, for anything that explained why the one route they had come to rely on was no longer open. Some stepped out, the crunch of gravel sharper in the stillness, voices low, controlled, trying to understand what had shifted overnight without warning. I watched it all without moving, not out of detachment, but because there was nothing to add. The situation spoke for itself more clearly than any explanation could. Within minutes, the line stretched back toward the entrance of the development, a steady buildup of vehicles that had nowhere else to go, because there was no alternate route, no secondary exit, no backup plan built into their design. It was all there, exactly as the traffic study had outlined, exactly as their own filing had confirmed, a single point of ingress and egress, now closed by the one person they had chosen to ignore. A county patrol vehicle arrived shortly after, lights off, no urgency, just procedure, the officer stepping out with the kind of calm that comes from dealing with situations that look complicated but are not once you understand the facts. I handed over the documentation before he even asked. Ownership records, updated filings, permits for the gate installation, everything aligned and ready, and he took his time reviewing it, flipping through pages while the line of cars behind him continued to grow. When he looked up, there was no argument, no negotiation, just a simple acknowledgement that the structure was private and that access control fell within my rights, followed by a brief conversation with a few of the drivers that ended the same way, with understanding replacing expectation. Word traveled quickly after that, not through announcements, but through realization. Each person who turned around carrying the same information back into the development, that the route they had been using was no longer available without permission. I did not need to raise my voice, did not need to call anyone out, did not need to explain the entire situation to every individual affected, because the system they had built did that for me. Every stalled car, every delayed delivery, every missed schedule was a direct reflection of a single overlooked detail, ownership. And standing there as the sun began to rise higher, burning off the last of the fog and revealing the full length of the line that had formed behind the gate, I could see it clearly on every face, not anger, not even frustration at first, but the quiet realization that something they had taken for granted had never actually belonged to them in the first place. And that realization carried more weight than anything I could have said. The call started before the line of cars had fully cleared, not frantic, not chaotic, but controlled in that way people sound when they are trying to maintain authority while the ground shifts under them. And I let the phone ring the first time, not out of avoidance, but because timing still mattered, even now. By the second call, I answered. Victoria did not waste time with pleasantries, her voice steady but tighter than before, the smooth confidence from our first meeting now carrying a sharper edge as she asked what I thought I was doing, as if the answer was not already visible to anyone standing at that gate. I told her exactly what I was doing, nothing more, nothing less. Exercising control over private infrastructure that had been used without authorization, and for a brief moment there was silence on the line, the kind that comes when someone realizes the conversation they expected is not the one they are having. She shifted quickly, talking about impact, about residents, about how disrupting access created complications that extended beyond a simple property dispute, and I listened, not interrupting, because everything she was saying now was already documented in their own filing. Every concern, every dependency, every consequence they had outlined themselves. When she finished, I responded with the same clarity I had offered in her office, that ownership had not changed, that no easement had been granted, that continued use without agreement was never authorized, and that the current situation was a direct result of decisions made without addressing that reality. There was a pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again the tone had shifted, not softer, but more deliberate, asking what it would take to resolve the situation, and that was the moment. Everything aligned. I had already prepared the answer, not as a reaction but as a structure, terms that reflected exactly what the bridge was, what it carried, and what it meant to control it. I explained that any continued access would require a formal agreement, not a temporary arrangement, not a handshake, but a legally binding contract that recognized the bridge as private infrastructure, established clear usage rights, defined maintenance responsibilities, and included compensation proportional to the level of dependency their entire community had placed on it. I could hear her processing that, not just the numbers but the implications, because this was no longer a small adjustment. This was a restructuring of something they had already built and sold as complete. She asked for time, said she needed to consult with her legal team, her board, and I told her that was reasonable, that the gate would remain in place until an agreement was reached, and that access could be granted temporarily for emergency services under controlled conditions, because this was never about creating risk, it was about correcting a foundation that had been ignored. By the end of the day, the tone across every communication had changed, not just from her, but from the entire system behind her. Emails that had once carried assumptions now carried requests. Language that once implied authority now acknowledged it did not exist where they thought it did. Over the next few days, meetings were scheduled, documents exchanged, terms negotiated, and for the first time since this began, every conversation was grounded in the same reality, that the bridge was mine, and everything they had built depended on it. When the final agreement was signed, it was thorough, precise, and enforceable, outlining licensed access, defined responsibilities, and compensation that reflected the true value of what they had been using without understanding. I stood on the bridge that evening as the gate opened again, the same steady flow of vehicles resuming, but this time it felt different, not because the traffic had changed, but because the structure beneath it had finally been recognized for what it was, not a convenience, not an assumption, but a controlled point in a system that now had to respect it. And as the last car passed and the sound of engines faded back into the distance, I knew that what had been taken for granted was now something they would never overlook again. The bridge feels different now, not in the way it carries weight or how the boards sound under tires, but in how it is seen, how it is understood, and that shift is something you can sense even before you see it. The traffic still flows, steady and predictable, morning light reflecting off windshields as vehicles cross in the same patterns they always have. But there is a pause now, a subtle hesitation at the entrance where the signage stands clean and deliberate, where the gate sits integrated into the structure like it was always meant to be there, where people look, just for a second, before they move forward. The air carries the same mix of river moisture and sun-warmed metal, the same quiet hum of movement beneath the surface, but the assumption is gone, replaced by awareness, and that changes everything without altering a single physical detail. The agreement is not something you can see from the road, but it is present in every crossing, in every maintenance check scheduled on time, in every inspection report filed with precision, in every communication that now comes through proper channels instead of assumptions written on paper. Victoria does not stand on overlooks anymore with the same effortless certainty, her presence still controlled, but now grounded in something real, something defined. And when we cross paths, there is no tension, no need for it, just acknowledgement, because the system we operate in now is clear to both sides. The community behind the bridge continues to grow, homes filling in, routines settling. But there is a boundary that exists now not as a line on a map, but as a recognized part of how everything functions. And that boundary holds because it was finally established the right way. I still walk the length of the bridge the same way I did the first time, boots moving across wood and steel, listening to the structure, feeling the subtle shifts that tell you everything is working as it should, because at its core nothing about the bridge has changed. It is still what it has always been, a piece of infrastructure designed to carry load, to connect two sides, to do its job quietly and reliably. The difference is that now the system around it respects that role instead of taking it for granted. Sometimes I stand there, at dusk, when the traffic has thinned and the sky turns that deep color that reflects off the water just right, and I think about how close this came to becoming something else, something uncontrolled, something that would have slowly erased ownership through habit and assumption, the way it often does when no one steps in to correct it. But that is the thing about systems. They do not fix themselves. They follow the path that is easiest until something forces them to adjust. I did not need to raise my voice, did not need to create a spectacle, did not need to turn it into anything more than what it was, a simple correction applied at the exact point where everything depended. And now every car that crosses, every delivery that arrives, every routine that continues does so on a foundation that is no longer invisible, no longer assumed, but clearly defined and understood. Because in the end, they did not just learn who owned the bridge, they learned what it means when an entire system is built on something you do not control, and how quickly that system can change when that reality is finally acknowledged.